Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the third Thursday webinar. We have 88 people registered for the webinar today, which is almost a record for our webinars. But we've only got 50 folks on so far. So I'll make a few introductory comments, then I'll introduce Mike and Brian to you, and we'll launch. I want to welcome, if you haven't been on these webinars before, I especially want to give you a big welcome. My name is Shawn Morford. I'm the Executive Director for the Network of Oregon Watershed Councils in Salem. And I am the moderator for these third Thursday webinars. This is sponsored by the Oregon Conservation Partnership, of which the network is a part. And we do these once a month on the third Thursday at 10 o'clock for SWCDs and watershed councils and land trusts in Oregon. And I see from the registration list there's a lot of folks from out of state. You got the word about this somehow, so you're more than welcome to join any of these webinars. That you see that you are interested in the topic. These webinars are sponsored, hosted by the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, as well as we receive financial support from Pacific Corrugated Pipe. So we thank them very much for enabling these webinars to happen. In a minute, I'm going to set the context a little bit for the topic, but I want to give you just a little bit of housekeeping stuff before we get started. Many of you have been on lots of webinars, so you know some of this already. Everybody is muted by default, but there's a couple of different ways that you can ask questions or make comments during the webinar, and Mike and Brian suggest that we hold the questions until both of them are finished so they can get through their content, and they're going to leave plenty of time at the end. So you can either type your question in the question box, and I'll be hanging on to those and compiling them, and we'll share those with Mike and Brian afterwards. You can also raise your little icon hand, and that will let me know you want to be unmuted, and you can ask your question or make a comment verbally. But again, we'll hold those until after Brian and Mike are done. There are 3 handouts. They look like peer-reviewed articles that have been uploaded, and you are welcome to download them. They will be posted on the Network of Oregon Watershed Council's website under events, along with the recording of the webinar today. So, and I think, I'm not sure, I didn't ask Mike or Brian whether they were going to post their PowerPoints or not, but that's a possibility. Just a reminder that these webinars happen and that we would like to hear from you about topics that you are interested in having a discussion on, either as a discussion or as a training opportunity. We're not going to have one in April because of the Connect conference that many of us are involved in, but we will resume on May 16th, and the topic will be government relations, political engagement, and an update on the Oregon State Legislature that's underway right now. Last thing is that there is a short survey at the end of the webinar, and we want to get your feedback on this webinar and give us some ideas for future webinars. These webinars are free, so your tuition is taking the time to fill these surveys out. We really need to tell our funders the difference that they make, and we all need to tell our bosses what we're spending our time on. So we really do appreciate the moment you take to fill those out. Today's presenters include Mike Wilson, who's with the PNW Research Station with the Forest Service, although he's in LeGrand, not in Portland, where the research station is. And Mike Endres is Assistant Professor of Animal and Rangeland Science at Oregon State University, and he's also located in LeGrand. And I just want to say, before I hand it over to them, that this webinar was actually initiated by Ken Fetcho with OWED, with the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, in coordination with the Forest Service and OSU. And Ken could not be here today, so I agreed to set a little bit of the context for what Mike and Brian are going to be talking about. Ken says that this webinar is among the ways that OWEB is fulfilling its strategic plan that was approved by the board last year. And it relates to OWEB's strategic priority number 6, which is coordinating, monitoring, and shared learning to advance watershed restoration effectiveness. And that's intended to ensure that decision-making at all levels is driven by insights derived from data and results. So if you're familiar with the strategic plan, you might know strategy 6.3 and 6.4 of the plan is to develop guidance and technical support for monitoring and to increase communication between science and practitioners. So here we have the science, and many of you are on the practitioner side, so they're fulfilling that. OWEB was involved in co-funding past restoration work and effectiveness monitoring that Mike and Brian are going to be referring to on the Starkey Experimental Forest. Their efforts to distill and communicate findings from their monitoring projects at forums such as this are an important part of OWEB's ability to put successful restoration projects on the ground in Oregon. And OWEB encourages everybody to have a look at their strategic plan. And Ken wanted you to know that it's available on the OWEB website with links from the OWEB homepage. So with that background and introduction, I'm going to hand it over first, I think, to Mike to get us started with the introduction, and then Brian will take over from there, and I guess we'll see Mike at the end.
All right. Thank you, Sean. This is Mike Wisdom. I'm a research biologist with the Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station, and I'm going to give a kind of a broad overview of the Meadow Creek Monitoring and Research Project, and specifically focus on the grazing and fish kinds of design for the work. And the first slide here, I just want to recognize a variety of collaborators in the grazing and fish work at Meadow Creek. They're all listed there, including Brian Endress, who's a key collaborator. And then on the bottom, there are logos of various collaborators. There are many, many partners involved with the work. Next slide, please. Meadow Creek flows through the Starkey Experimental Forest and Range, which is shown outlined there. Meadow Creek runs right through the middle of it. It's an area formally designated for monitoring and research by the Forest Service. It's in northeast Oregon. About 7.5 miles of stream, Meadow Creek, runs through it. It's part of the Grand Ronde River, which is part of the Columbia Basin. Next. And stream systems like Meadow Creek have a variety of different legacy effects that are very typical of many stream systems in the Columbia Basin, ranging from splash dam logging, railroad logging, roads, livestock grazing, conversion of native vegetation, exotic livestock forages that have over time led to some pretty dramatic damage to riparian systems. This picture is one of 1953. This was actually a research project at the time by the PNW station to convert the riparian area to livestock forage on Meadow Creek. So you can see there's a pretty dramatic change. Next. And this is a picture of Meadow Creek basically before restoration in 2012. What's obvious to any fisheries biologist is the lack of any in-stream woody debris or boulders that basically provide key structures for spawning and rearing of salmonids. Next. There are two species of threatened salmonids at Meadow Creek. Snake River steelhead population both uses it for spawning and juvenile rearing. And historically, we had Snake River, spring, summer Chinook salmon. They're functionally extirpated from Meadow Creek. There is some juvenile rearing, however. Next. We had some key restoration objectives. These were set forth by the LeGrand District of the Forest Service that does a lot of in-stream restoration, riparian restoration, basically to restore the in-stream debris, important for spawning and rearing of salmonids, to restore the woody vegetation in the riparian area, important for stream shading, to mediate lethal summer stream temperatures, the juveniles. That's a big problem, and restore basically the function of these systems. And then we added on as part of our monitoring research to evaluate the compatibility of cattle and wild ungulate grazing. Next. So from 2012 to 2014, the Grand District implemented through a very large grant from EPA and other sources, put in about 60 clusters of boulders and large woody debris across the 7F miles of Meadow Creek. Also, almost 60,000 shrubs, seedlings, and conifers were planted in the riparian area. Next. We added to this because what occurred in a research area, so we built more structures conducive to doing our monitoring and our research, and we added 3.5 miles of new livestock fencing to create the pastures that we want to create for the grazing research. 9 large ungulate exposures, Brian will talk a little more about them, each about 2.5 acres in size, to exclude and include different kinds of ungulates, wild versus domestic versus complete exclusion. And then on the bottom left, you'll see these are called pods. These enclose about half of the plantings from ungulate herbivory, and the other half are exposed to ungulate herbivory. Next. And restoration monitoring for salmonids was a big part of this. The Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, Ted Sedell, Chris Horn led this to use the Columbia Habitat Monitoring Program to monitor habitat changes in response to restoration, and then also annual adult spawning and juvenile rearing counts done in spring and late summer, respectively. Next. I'm just going to quickly go over some of the responses to the restoration in terms of fish responses. You can see in the upper left there, this is a Meadow Creek discharge from our discharge station there on site. And you can see a big peak there with the red arrow pointing to it. That was March of 2014. So this was immediately following the in-stream restoration the prior years. And you can see the woody debris that's been deposited by design in the lower pictures. Next. That big scouring event really made a difference. This is a in-stream restoration champ, basically a gradient of 3D gradient of the stream system, and you can see the places where it says future large woody debris placements, and then go to the next slide, you'll see the changes post restoration. So you can see what's happened here. We not only have an increase in deep pools, but we also have channel depth increasing, as well as dispersion of sediment and redistribution of gravel and creation of spawning areas. So basically, all of the monitoring has been showing that effective monitoring, this has been very successful for restoration for salmonid goals. Next. And they also looked at juvenile counts of salmonids, and a little hard to see this, but the front bars, the first 2 rows of the front bars are actually reference streams. So this is across years, and then if you look at the back bars, those are the actual counts of juvenile salmonids in the areas of restoration. And what you can see is overall a larger amount of juveniles that are supported by the areas of restoration. There is a lot of variability across the years, of course, and I'll mention that at the end, the reasons why that might be occurring. Next. What was different here is then we wanted to add in a monitoring component related to understanding the effects of wild versus domestic ungulate herbivory on riparian restoration, and then specifically then to test effectiveness of cattle grazing practices thought to be compatible with riparian restoration with salmonids. Next. And there are 4 different basic treatment levels from a monitoring and research standpoint that we're evaluating, and these are shown here, those 4 listed. And you can see these are laid out. These are the actual boundaries of one of our sets of replicates of these 4 different treatment levels. Each of those bounded areas, the 1, 2, and 3, are about 2.5 acres in size and run toe slope to toe slope the entire riparian area as well as the stream channel to evaluate these different effects of deer and elk versus cattle versus complete ungulate exclusion versus what we call extant grazing, which would be free-range grazing by cattle, deer, and elk. Next. And with the cattle grazing, I'll just mention this as background for Brian's talk. We actually had a number of years for recovery of the riparian restoration practices in the absence of cattle grazing. That often is typical of federal grazing following restoration with some rest. So we began this in 2017. So that provided a nice opportunity to actually evaluate the effects of deer and elk herbivory in the absence of cattle, but following the shrub restoration plantings. The cattle grazing system that began in 2017 included 80 cow-calf pairs. It runs from about June 1 to October 1. It's a deferred rotation. Stocking rates are moderate for our initial test. It basically involves regular monitoring of herd locations with a range rider and forage utilization and regular maintenance of fences and upland water. Next. These are the 5 pastures in which the grazing is occurring. These are fairly small pastures. That's by design so that we can understand the responses. There is one large pasture, pasture 5, in contrast to the other 4. But this provides a nice environment in which to conduct the monitoring research. Next. This is a map of the upland water sources. I mentioned upland water was basically implemented as part of the restoration in all the pastures. So on the southern and northern bounds of each of these pastures, on the upper portions, we have some source of functional water across seasons. Next. The idea for that upland water is to draw and hold cattle away from the riparian area in the stream for watering. So the herd management approach with an active range riding is basically a very basic strategy, and that is to move cattle to upland water sources upon first entry to a pasture, and to split those 80 cow-calf pairs according to what is deemed to be the acceptable forage and water on each side of the upland pastures, on each side of the creek. And then to monitor the riparian zone for cattle presence by the range rider every few days. Next. In turn, then we do active monitoring of green line stubble height, stream bank alteration, and woody browse use in the riparian areas. These are the things that we need to be concerned about as ecological indicators for compliance with grazing compatible with riparian restoration. And if cattle start to spend an undesired amount of time in the riparian area, to actively move them back to the upland areas is warranted. And then, of course, to move them to the next pasture when any of 3 different trigger thresholds are met related to monitoring of green line stubble height, stream bank alteration, or woody browse use. Next. And the range rider carries a GPS unit, maintains a daily log of activities. About half of the cows actually wear GPS collars. We get locations every half hour, 24/7 through the grazing season, so that we can document time spent by cattle in uplands versus riparian areas, how much time they spend in areas near the upland water and supplementation sites that we also put near the water, and in relation to a suite of environmental conditions affecting cattle distribution, so that ultimately we're going to build what we call habitat or use models or resource selection models to predict the probability that cattle will spend time in the uplands versus riparian area, given the range rider effort and all the associated environmental conditions. Next. There are a variety of other response variables. It's a very diverse set of responses, and I won't really talk about most of these, but I did want to mention that there are many other collaborators involved in the research related to the grazing effects. Next. This is another topographic map of the 5 pastures, and the darkest blue is the flattest slope, and then it shades to the widest, which is the steepest slopes, which are over 50%, just as background context. Next. And these are the black locations are actually the cattle locations overlaid for 2017 onto that topographic map. And I think what's pretty obvious here is that we've achieved a very good even upland distribution in pastures 1 and 2, where we have the flattest terrain, in portions of pasture 5, where we have portions of upland pastures that are very flat, and not very good distribution in 3 and 4, where we have some of the steepest terrain. And it's just an example of the kind of data that we're starting to analyze now. Next. Just some summary points then for what we found, and we do have Sean mentioned a number of publications on some of this, and we're working on other manuscripts, but basically in-stream restoration substantially improved spawning and rearing habitat following the high flows. Juvenile salmonid population responses showed a positive but a variable increase thus far, One of the challenges there in measuring population responses, obviously, is there's a lot of off-site factors in the Columbia system beyond the things that we're doing for restoration. And of course, many desired restoration responses require long time periods and long-term monitoring to document beyond what we've done thus far. Probably the biggest one is trying to increase stream shading from the increase in shrub and conifers and to reduce the stream temperatures. Next. And the range runner managed cattle grazing, as we kind of hypothesized, probably has a role to be compatible with riparian restoration objectives, but probably is going to be more successful in places like pastures that have uplands with flat to moderate terrain, forest or grassland habitat types during the early stages of grazing, usually June and July, where there's a lot of forage growth and really maturation, and then has reliable upland water, but probably less compatible in some of the pastures. And we've got this wide spectrum to do this evaluation that have steep terrain where it's very hard to keep cattle in the uplands and that steep terrain to use it effectively, and that are composed of mostly open grasslands that tend to have forage base that senesces during late season grazing, not as good at water. And we have some upland water and some pastures that are less reliable. So all of those things sort of add to less effectiveness. And like I said, we're quantifying these relationships now in some habitat use models. Next. This is just a Meadow Creek timeline to show this is a long-term monitoring and long-term research endeavor. There are many different activities as treatments, but also many different responses that have been implemented over time. And as long as we can continue to gain the resources and keep our collaborations going, we will have, I think, a wealth of different kinds of information that will be generated from this restoration effort and the grazing effects. Next. And I'll just leave you with an introduction to lead into Brian's talk about these 4 different treatment levels of herbivory, and he's going to talk about some of these effects in his presentation next.
I'll just remind folks, this is Sean, I just want to remind you that if you have questions, you can type it in the question box, and I'll be compiling those throughout the presentations going forward, and we'll have a chance at the end.
All right, thanks, thanks, Sean. Yeah, so this is Brian Anderson. As was indicated, I'm an assistant professor here at Oregon State University, and I just wanted to spend a little bit of time sharing some of the results from our monitoring program, really with emphasis focusing on the riparian and vegetation responses that we've been seeing for the last couple of years. So I'm going to just give you a real brief outline of kind of how we're approaching our monitoring of the uplands or in the riparian areas, sort of out of the stream riparian areas, share some of the results that we have from the work since we started it before the cows came onto Meadow Creek, and then share some of the results that we in terms of changes following the 2 years of cattle grazing, and then have some summary points, and then Mike will jump back on and talk about some of our next steps in how we want to approach supporting riparian restoration in Meadow Creek. So really two quick things in terms of our monitoring program. I just want to have a brief discuss some of this camera trap array that we have, and then I'll do kind of the deep dive into our vegetation responses. So obviously, as Mike indicated, we're really interested in trying to understand how cattle, elk, and deer all kind of utilize the whole watershed, but obviously in particularly in the riparian area. And in addition to the GPS collars that Mike referred to on some of the cattle, we also have systematically placed about 40 cameras all along Meadow Creek, and not only along Meadow Creek, sort of like on the green line, but then we also have cameras focused on those upland water developments and nutrient supplement sites that Mike referred to. And those are areas that we're trying to encourage more better distribution of cattle across the grazing season. And this data, while we're still plowing through thousands and thousands of videos, is very helpful for us to really kind of track and document, kind of the who, what, when, and where a lot of these ungulates are spending their time and what they're doing along the restoration area. And what this will really help us do is to better link our vegetation monitoring data and restoration and riparian recovery with time spent and activity by cattle, elk, and deer. So this is sort of a complementary data set that's going to be really useful as we try to better understand what's happening on the ground. And here you can just see some slides of various pictures that we've been able to capture, and these go year round, and we've maintained them for 4 years now. Okay, so in terms of the vegetation response, really I'm going to tell you a little bit about the design and then explain and share some results from 3 primary vegetation monitoring efforts. One is tracking the growth and survival of those restoration plantings, those almost 60,000 plantings that went in the ground. Talk about just overall woody plant recovery in the riparian area, and then green line condition metrics. So this is a very busy figure, and this is a little bit more extensive monitoring effort than most restoration plans, simply because we also have this research component. But kind of at the bottom part of the screen, you can see the different pastures 1 through 5, and then what we did before right while the plants were being put in the ground is we established about 180 transects that go toe slope to toe slope, so it's perpendicular to Meadow Creek, and we use these as areas where we can track growth and survival of the plantings that went in, as well as overall shrub and woody plant development across the whole riparian area. So it's much broader than just the green line. So much of our monitoring data comes from this set. Mike mentioned those 4 different grazing treatments that we have, sort of a cattle only, elk and deer only, complete ungulate exclusion, and then sort of the extent where cattle, elk, and deer can all graze. We have a higher density of those plots in the areas associated with those exclosures. So that's kind of these little insets that we see. We sample a little bit higher density there, so we have a really good handle on how the different herbivory treatments might affect recovery of the riparian area. So just want to share some of the results, kind of the big picture findings that we found so far. And I first want to share the results that we found when we were doing all this monitoring before the cattle grazing was initiated. So this is really just looking at how elk and deer might affect restoration and some of these riparian monitoring metrics. So first and foremost, one of kind of the big takeaway points is that, and may not be a surprise to many of you, but elk and deer had a very large effect on the growth and survival of those plants that went into the ground. So there's a lot going on here on this slide, but if you look to the left on that figure, we have growth over 2 years in centimeters on the y-axis, and then we have 4 different species: cottonwood, currant, hawthorn, and willow. So the four of the species that were planted, and then we're just comparing growth between plants that were exposed to elk and deer and ones that were inside those pods, right? They couldn't be browsed. And you can clearly see after just 2 years, there's a significant difference in terms of average growth per plant. And you can also see some of the species are maybe a little bit more resilient to herbivory than others, whereas cottonwoods essentially were either 0 or got smaller than when they were planted. Some other ones were still able to add some height to over those 2 years. On the right side of the figure is just kind of a survival figure where going over the 2 years, and the dark black symbols are those plants that were exposed to the herbivores, and then the white ones are ones that were in those pods that were protected. And I think there's 2 things you can see here is, number one, some species had better survival than others, right, even when they were protected. So in this case, the currants and the hawthorns had very high survival, around 80%, 90% over 2 years. And the cottonwoods and willows did fine, but they were a little bit lower in terms of their survival. But they all had significantly reduced survival rates when they were exposed to elk and deer. And again, you can also see here some species, such as your currants and your hawthorns, did survive better than our cottonwood, which were pretty much had less than 5% survival rate over 2 years. Now, we always want to say, well, we had 2 wild ungulates in the system, you know, what seems to be driving this? And I'm not going to present the data today, but essentially we estimated the elk use in the riparian area was about 11 times greater than deer. So it's a pretty good suggestion that predominantly elk are driving this negative effect on growth and survival. So the protection, right? It was clear that it seemed to work pretty well, but then that leads to the following question is, well, how long is it going to work? And what we seem to be finding is that it may not work for as long as we may want. So if you look at this top chart here, we sort of have these vertical lines indicating the exposure height, and then the browse line, and then the height distributions of plants that were protected or not. And so on those gray shaded bars, those are the areas that those plants that are in the pods. And while they are in general taller, they're not quite hitting even the exposure height, and they certainly aren't getting above the browse line anytime soon. And in fact, when you look at this lower figure, this is just looking at plants. Well, if you're looking at the percent of the plantings that were browsed in year 1 and year 2, both protected and unprotected, if you just focus on the gray bars here, these protected, right, these are the plants that were in those pods. The first year, maybe 5% of them, right, you have an elk that kind of leans in and takes a nibble. But even by year 2, over a quarter of the plants that were in a protected situation were still being browsed, right? So this kind of leads to some concerns on, well, while putting in pods and things like this in the short term, it's not necessarily, might not help get these plants to get above the browse line and create the shade and those kind of those things that we want from a management objective standpoint. And in fact, just to kind of test this, after about 4 years of protection, we pulled some of the pods off to see how those plants that were bigger, how they performed. And we haven't finished analyzing the data, but pretty much most of the benefits of protection were lost within 2 years of the pods removal. So again, the long-term prospects are still somewhat of a challenge in these situations where you have high elk abundances. Okay, so that's just kind of the actual plantings. Now, if we look at the overall shrub recovery across the riparian area, right? So this is toe slope, just toe slope. This is a couple years, I guess it's 3 years after planting, and on the left here, on the left of your screen, we have deciduous woody cover, and on the y-axis is just basically segments, so kind of going from east to west across Meadow Creek. And the gray indicates shrub cover that was due to existing shrubs, and then the little black slivers are shrubbed cover from the actual plantings. So a couple things to note here is, first of all, you have a lot of variation in your shrub cover across Meadow Creek, and even after 4 years, and again, this may not be a particular surprise, very little of the cover is coming from the actual restoration itself, right? So this is a long-term process, and spending a lot of time monitoring over a short span of time may not be the best bang for your buck in trying to assess what's going to happen in the future. My guess is it's going to take 8 to 10 years to really understand how those plantings contribute to overall cover. On the right, this is just looking at of the natural existing vegetation, existing shrub cover on site, what proportion of it were the species that we went in and put back in. So you can see from the black bars, a lot of the species that we put in with the hand cement plantings were already on site, right? So on one hand, that's good because they should be, maybe it might be good for the site. But the other question that we want to think about is, if those plants are already on site, why are we still having a challenge getting these shrubs to get above the browse line? So kind of the take-home message from this work so far is, one, we're going to really need long-term monitoring, maybe less intensive, but over longer time periods to assess success. And if we want to successfully establish shrubs in these riparian areas, rather than just continue to just plant species, we really have to look at the underlying cause of why these plants are suppressed. Otherwise, might be a lot of time and money that may not be as effective as we would want. Okay, so and then the third kind of results I wanted to share before the cows came on is we did a lot of green line monitoring. So we established some DMAs. So this is kind of the multiple indicator monitoring protocols, the MIM surveys, and we did these even before the cows came on. And here today I'm just going to talk about stubble height, stream bank alteration, and woody species use. And these were concentrated in and around those ungulate herbivory treatments, so we could really see how these metrics changed under different herbivory scenarios. So first thing that we thought was pretty interesting, because we're used to thinking elk and deer eat shrubs and cows eat grass. Well, in the absence of cows, we still found that elk and deer had measurable effect on green line stubble height. So here on this figure, this is stubble height on the y-axis, and then these the triangles are symbols for either areas where the elk and deer were excluded or they were exposed to elk and deer. And the only difference here is the all refers to we did all species for stubble height, and the dominant is if you just measure the 5 or 10 most dominant species. So the big picture here is, yes, elk and deer do indeed reduce stubble height. And so the take-home message here is that if you're in situations with cattle and elk and deer all in the same site and you're monitoring stubble height, don't always assume that reductions in stubble height are due to cattle, right? These elk are also having an effect on stubble height. So another thing about stubble height to think about is oftentimes it's used as a surrogate to assess woody browse use. So, the idea is that if you have fairly high, good stubble height, species, these ungulates aren't going to switch off onto woody plants, and particularly with respect to cattle. But in these situations where you only have elk and deer, you may have fairly high, stubble heights way above any kind of trigger or terms and conditions requirement. But at the same time, your woody species use may be still incredibly high. And so, again, the take-home message in this situation, especially if you're dealing with watersheds and riparian areas with cattle, elk, and deer, is that if you're just looking at stubble height as sort of an indicator of what might be happening with your woody browse use, that may not be as helpful as one might think. So sort of one of those things is when you have abundant elk and deer, you can look at stubble height, but you also need to pay attention to your woody species use values because they're not well correlated. So in terms of the summary of results here, we can go pretty quick, right? We found a negative effect on survival and growth from wild ungulates. Protection helps in the short term, but we really don't know what that might mean over the long term, which might be 10 plus years in order to really get these shrubs established, because that rate of recovery is so slow. And then thinking about, and a pretty interesting finding is that when we're doing green line metrics generally associated with assessing cattle use in herbivory, understand that the elk and deer can also affect those. And so that might affect how you think about management on your site. So just some brief conversations, because we're still analyzing this data, and share some info on what happened once we put cattle into the system. And so here I'm just going to talk about the green line measurements that are obviously really important for sort of terms and conditions right now. So that's stream bank alteration, stubble height, and woody browse use. What we found from this is just data. And here on the bottom, we have our 4 different ungulate treatments, right? Complete exclusion, cattle, herbivory, deer and elk herbivory, and then all 3 of them combined. And we have sort of 2 measurements. So we measured these variables right when the cows came off of a pasture, right? So right after we transitioned them from, say, pasture 4 to 5, and then at the end of the season. And there's a couple things here that are pretty clear and obvious is by and large, when we look at alterations to stream banks, right, cattle are the main contributor. You look at the elk and deer treatment, very minimal. So even though they may have a big impact on woody use, or they may have an impact on stubble height, they don't seem to be affecting stream bank alteration to any measurable degree, while the cattle tend to have a little bit of are the driver of alterations to stream banks. It's a little bit different when we talk about stubble height, right? We already showed that we know that elk and deer can alter stubble height. And here, again, we have our 4 treatments down at the bottom: none, cattle, deer and elk, and cattle, deer and elk. And what you can see, for example, with the cattle treatments, when the cows came off, right, the average height was about 8.6 inches. Again, that's fine. And then by the end of the year, there was a little bit of regrowth, so you got some increase, so around 9.5 inches of stubble height on average. Deer and elk were actually quite similar in terms of their values. And then what's really interesting, though, is when you have cattle, deer, and elk combined, you still see your stubble height anywhere, well above standards. So, but when you kind of compare the differences between those treatments, cattle are about, responsible essentially about 65% of the reduction in stubble height, whereas wild ungulates are about 35%. So again, it's important to remember that all of these animals affect stubble height. And the other thing that's interesting is that the stubble height reductions by elk and deer go later in the year. So because they stay longer, because the cows come off here, October 1st, October 15th, but late in the season, the elk and deer are still in these systems further reducing stubble height. So again, that means just something to keep in mind, trying to assess the very end of the season stubble height, and what elk and deer may or may not be doing to the riparian area. And then finally, woody species use, again, by treatment. And again, this is kind of the mixed bag. Again, we're used to thinking that just elk and deer are affecting woody species use, and that turns out not to be the case at all, right? So in this case, we have deer and elk use at the end of the season was around 32%, but when you have cattle, elk, and deer all combined, we had upwards of almost 50% use in the riparian area. So again, the take-home message here is just because you have woody plant use, don't assume it's all elk and deer. Cattle are playing a role in woody plant use as well. And then, of course, your use depends on your composition. So you actually get different data depending on how you look at it and what your management objectives are. So here on the left, these are use categories. So basically it's like 0 to 20% liters browsed, all the way up to 80 to 100% liters browsed. And what you see if you look at all woody shrubs together, you have a number who have very high use, and then a pretty large bucket where little to no use. And it's probably not much of a surprise, but if you just pull out the species that are highly palatable and selective, right? So your willows, cottonwood, and cottonwood, and dogwood. On the right of your screen here, you see that their use was really high, but other species such as alder were really, really low. So these are things that you may want to think about as you're planning restoration efforts when you have a lot of elk and deer in your system, is trying to find perhaps those species that can grow tall and fast that are perhaps not as palatable. Now, again, it just depends on your management objectives for your site if those species are ones that make sense for you. And then finally, I'm not really going to share or talk about this information as well, just kind of talk about the value of sort of this long-term monitoring. So we can really track these changes to the metrics, whether they're stream bank alteration or stubble height or woody plant use over time. And so we can then link that back to where and when these ungulates are in the landscape and our different treatments. And hopefully through that, we can get a better sense of just how we can find ways to support ecological restoration on these sites under different grazing and herbivory scenarios. So final summary points, take-home messages, right? Cattle were responsible for nearly all the stream bank alterations so far. When we talk about stubble height and woody species use, they're sort of all involved in affecting those metrics, so you want to think about that. Elk and deer continue to reduce the stubble height and browse woody species even after you pull cows off your system. So again, that's another thing to think about if you're getting close to you're trying to assess grazing appropriateness in your riparian area. And obviously, long-term data is really required because this is a really slow responding system. So we need to kind of pace ourselves in our monitoring so we can actually get to the end and see what's happening over longer time frames than just even 5 years. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mike. He's going to talk about kind of one of our big next steps, which is focusing on maybe one of the underlying drivers of kind of suppressed shrubs, which would be reducing elk by 80% in this watershed, which is a pretty novel thing that you can't do in very many situations. So I'm going to hand it off to Mike here, and he can briefly talk about that.
All right. Thanks, Brian. I just have a couple of slides to go through, not many. I'll be pretty quick here. But basically, because we're a research area, Starkey Experimental Forest and Range, we actually do have the option to do manipulative landscape experiments. And so in this case, because of the controversy and interest over elk herbivory on shrub recovery for riparian restoration, it seems to be something that's common to a lot of different restoration projects. That one is a big issue for everyone. We actually want to reduce the elk population substantially and then replant the riparian area to see if we get a different response, basically with a very low population size. Brian, I think you've got the end of the first slideshow up there.
Oh, yeah, look at that.
So the plan, starting this fall at Starkey, is to implement a series of intensive hunts. And public hunting has always been part of our research at Starkey. And so we have permitted hunters, and we will have a series of different types of hunts on elk that basically our goal is to reduce the population by about 80%. These are the phases here shown in this slide. We started with restoration in 2012 to 2014, and we've got these phases that are listed there. And then starting in 2020, following the 2019 reduction, we will be in a new phase where we will replant and then look at that response of the riparian shrubs to that substantial reduction in the elk. Currently, we have about 500 elk. We hope to get to about 100. Next. Why don't we go next one, Brian? So we can, next one. So I think I mentioned this. So the plan is that we would reduce the elk population in late 2019. We'd replant shrubs across all of Meadow Creek again in 2020 to evaluate growth and survival under a low elk density. And this elk reduction, we're fairly assured that we can do it because of the hunts that are controlled hunts, but also most of the elk that remain after hunting season come to our winter area, and we can actually translocate the needed numbers out of our study area to achieve that effect. Next. And we had a lot of different kinds of funding sources for this work. We're going to be developing and submitting an OEB restoration grant proposal for the plantings in 2020, followed by a proposal for effectiveness monitoring to look at the response. Next. And I think I'll end it here. I just wanted to mention that, you know, I think many things you've probably heard for results so far are things that have to do with ungulate management that some people may say, well, that makes perfect sense. You know, I already know that. Or others say, no, that's impractical. That just won't work or whatever. Everyone has a lot of different views on these topics. But in fact, the practicality, benefits, and effects of many of these practices remain untested across large landscapes at operational scales of management. So I think that's the key for this long-term monitoring, is it is operational at a large scale across 7.5 miles of these large pastures. And sure appreciate everyone being involved with the webinar here. And I think, Sean, we can open it up to questions.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Wow. So we have about 8 questions, and I think about 3 of them are on beavers. So I'll try and combine those questions. But let me just start with the first one that came in early on, Mike. Mike, did you use a standard for knowing when to move cattle off riparian areas? What standard was used to measure the stubble height and so on?
So we're in consultation with the National Marine Fisheries Service. We conduct compliance monitoring in real time during grazing for stubble height, stream bank alteration, woody browse use. So stubble height, it's not supposed to go below greenline stubble height 6 to 8 inches. Stream bank alteration is not supposed to be more than 20% bank alteration, and woody browse use of not to exceed about 40%. And there are triggers. So if you hit 8 inches stubble height, it's a trigger for a move. If you hit about 15% stream bank alteration, it's a trigger for a move. 35% or 30% woody browse use. So we do the real-time monitoring. It's very efficient. as part of our range routing too, and then we make decisions for moves so that we remain in compliance. So and those three indicators together, I think we're going to be evaluating their worth as ecological indicators for the overall stream health and riparian health, but they seem to be useful indicators, and there are some efficient ways that we've developed and will be publishing on how one can do that as part of monitoring during the grazing period in a pasture.
Okay, thank you. There were about 3 or 4 questions relating to beaver use, so I'll just try and summarize. What beaver use exists in the area, and if present, even transient use? Did you document any impact differences in the different treatments? Did you determine if impact to a plant was from beaver versus the ungulate?
I'll take a quick stab. Just that the exclosures we created appeared to be attractants to beavers, and we have had beavers come into all the complete ungulate exclosures in the adjacent areas. I wish I hadn't taken out some of the slides. I had a great one of a beaver dam with very flooded restoration areas. So even though this is I don't think I have it in that slideshow, Brian, but even though this is an ungulate, primarily an ungulate, what we did is found that we attracted through the ungulate exclusion and the riparian shrub recovery, we attracted beavers. So we do have beavers in the system now. They are changing some of the floodplain dynamics. They're desired, and we're trying to account for that as part of the monitoring work. And Brian, I know you've probably got more to add to that.
No, yeah, I would say, yeah, when we assess our browse effectiveness, the results that we presented did not involve beavers. It's pretty clear. So we kind of do a cause of death, assessment on some of those shrubs. But most of the data that I showed, actually, there weren't really beavers in our system. But now they've certainly come in, and as Mike said, they've put up some pretty substantial dams, which are changing things, which is exciting. From an experimental perspective, it makes it a little bit difficult because it's somewhat confounding, but it's a good thing. And the other thing is clearly, planting the willows and the cottonwoods serve multiple objectives, and one of them is beaver food. So that's also a little trade-off between trying to get shade on your stream over the long term while providing some food for beavers, which obviously have a lot of can change a lot of these riparian areas in many positive ways. So we're tracking that, and we also get them on the camera traps, which is kind of enjoyable to watch them mow down lodgepole and cottonwoods and drag them into the river. So yeah, so we have a sense of where they're at and what they're doing.
Okay, thank you. A couple questions about how you're defining or measuring stream bank alteration.
So for that, we're using the MIMS protocol, which is essentially these, a series of Daubenmeier frames that you kind of go along within your DMA, and you are monitoring. Basically, you're looking for hoof shear. Predominantly, that's the most alteration right along that, and you categorize each one of your frames based on sort of how many intercepts of hoof shear you get within sort of like a proportion, and then from that, for each DMA, you calculate your percentage that way. So it's all just kind of following the multiple indicator monitoring protocols, and we can actually probably attach that. If people are wanting the specific metrics on how to do that, we can probably send that out or send a link for it.
We can attach the link to the recording on the Network of Oregon Watershed Council's website.
Yeah, that'll work.
Or Brian, yeah. Okay, a couple more questions while we still have a couple minutes here. Did the stream restoration result as water table levels that would impact riparian survival and growth?
I don't. I wasn't. That work was done primarily by the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife fisheries scientists, Ted Savell, Chris Horn, and others. I wasn't involved directly with that. To the extent that the CHAMP work measures that, they have some indication of that, but I'm not aware of the direct measurements of that. And I left out a slide here, but in the future, one of our our aspirations for this work is to do whole watershed restoration, which would be to fuels reduce and fin and fuels reduction in the uplands to create more forage in the uplands as attractants to hold ungulates in the uplands, but also to couple that with more floodplain restoration. There's some new techniques beyond what was implemented when this was done at Meadow Creek for the in-stream restoration to raise the floodplain of the water table and the floodplain, and therefore create a more conducive environment for shrub growth and survival. I think that would be part of trying to get better measures of the floodplain and the water table and the hydrological regime. We did have one master student who did look at the background hydrology of the system as part of this. That was primarily with shrub recovery, but not so much with water table per se.
Okay, thank you. We have 3 more questions. Question for Mike. There were some slides that you skipped that listed, it talked about social research, and does the project elicit social scientists, and if so, what are they studying? Who and what are they studying?
Yeah, sorry about that. I was trying to get through the material for the question answer. Basically, we have a variety of different components to this work, this monitoring work, and so we're looking at ecological responses, and we've talked about a portion of them with the grazing effects and the fish responses, but there's native bee pollinator responses or small mammal responses, a lot of ecological research. But we also have economic research. All of the cattle are weighed and body condition scored before when they enter to start a grazing season and when they come off. So we actually have daily weight gains. We can compare that with other typical grazing systems, and we can do cost-benefit analyses of the investment of the range rider and the return we get for weight gain, given the kinds of changes in the grazing approach that we're taking here. And then last is the social science, and we're collaborating with Susan Charnley. She's the social scientist in the Pacific Northwest Research Station. She's surveyed ranchers across the mountains about their attitudes and their willingness to adopt new approaches for riparian management and public land grazing allotments. And then we will follow with other workshops and engaging those permittees, range permittees, in the sharing of these results and really interacting with them to understand how well they're willing to adopt some of the practices that are shown to be effective, and if not, why. Understand some of their hesitancy, and also quantify, capture their thoughts on how they might adopt things that we find that might be effective at Meadow Creek for their allotments. So that's going to be an ongoing process. There's grant funds, and that's basically integrated in with the social science, in with all our ecological and economic research and monitoring.
Okay, thank you. Okay, is there any work looking at the 303D listings, temperature, sedimentation, pH, in these grazing areas?
Not that I'm aware of. It could be added. We have a list of things like that would be desirable to add. We're open to it as long as we could find the way to collaborate with folks who have the expertise and the time to do it. That would be great.
Okay, well, we have a couple more minutes here. A few more questions have popped in. By the way, if we don't get to your question, we'll put these questions to Brian and Mike and make sure that we get them answered afterwards and sent out to you. But maybe we'll get through them here. Okay, could you explain why the combined herbivory treatment, all 3 species, had higher stubble height? Herbivory, yeah, herbivory. Had higher total stubble height.
Yeah, so that is likely an artifact of some variation in site conditions. So one of the things I didn't get to speak about is the cattle-only grazing treatment. When you think about these exclosures, it's very manipulative and very experimental. So basically, to just get the cattle only grazing effect, we have to put cows in enclosed area for kind of a set amount of time. So it's not exactly how they would be how they would utilize, let's say, a riparian area normally. So that might affect why the cattle only herbivory treatment was a little bit lower. Why the cattle, elk, and deer entirely was so that I would be cautious to do a direct comparison between the cattle only and the cattle, elk, and deer, because one is based on fairly small, these 2.5 acre treatments where we kind of had to put cows in for a set amount of time versus kind of free ranging cattle, elk, and deer where they can go where they want. So I would be cautious on that comparison. Why there's a difference between the cattle, elk, and deer stubble height, why it was higher than the elk and deer, they weren't significantly different. So there's like, when you look at the figure, it looks like their average was higher, but it was within the error. So that may, and we're still analyzing. Formally, we haven't formally analyzed it the proper way yet because we're still getting the data in. So it'll be interesting to see if that continues in the future, if that's real or just kind of an artifact at the moment.
Okay, two last questions. One you may have already addressed, but let me ask it anyway. Density and duration of cattle use is more straightforward to measure. How did cattle use compare to the density and duration of deer and elk?
Well, I think we're still, quantifying that, but cattle season of grazing obviously is the duration is much shorter because it's 4 months, basically June through the beginning of October, whereas Brian mentioned deer and elk are free ranging, basically out there from April through November, and some deer and elk overwinter in the area. So we actually do see, we have the camera trap set up. We've documented a very, very minor amount of use in the winter too. And a lot of that will be documented not only with the camera traps and the quantification of these things, but also in the habitat use modeling. We will be developing models that predict the probability of use of the riparian area and the upland portions of these pastures for not only cattle, but also for deer and elk in relation to a wide variety of environmental conditions. So we think those habitat use models will be quite useful for planning, for allotment management planning, because one, obviously, if you want to have pastures that have cattle access to riparian areas, then one can characterize those pastures according to the success that range riding may have in managing for primarily upland distribution of cattle and minimizing riparian use. And then given the background populations of deer and elk, if you have high populations in your allotment, you can use those models for deer and elk and also predict the probability of riparian use versus upland. And then with this elk density reduction, a different model will probably be available at that point to be able to predict the change in use given the lower density of elk in both the uplands and riparian areas. Hopefully that answers the question.
Okay, thank you. And I have one last question, but before I do this, somebody else just popped in with a quick one about fence heights. So did you look at different fence heights and what worked to keep deer and elk from jumping versus leaning over?
For this one, there was no formal research. The fence height, they're all kind of like 4-foot fence, and the reason for that was that the difficulty
Those are the pods.
The roads, right? For the pods, difficulty of getting and the expense of getting large, sort of 8-foot tall fence in there. So the pods, that was a logistical constraint by the restoration implementation and hauling all that gear in there. The large exclosures, those are 8-foot tall woven wire. They're nothing, the elk cannot jump into those. So, obviously the bigger the fence, I'll just put it that way. But if you make the exclosure too big and your fence is too small, the elk will jump in. So there's like this cost benefit between how wide you make the pod and how tall, and then time and labor and money. But yeah, that makes a big difference.
Okay, thank you. My last question then is around sort of the what next. Is there going to be an extension publication out of this, or how are folks going to stay on top of what the best management practices and the so what for decision making from this work?
Well, we have a collaborator is the OSU, Oregon State University Extension. We have an economist and a range scientist who's involved with the research. And, the plan is to continue with these webinars. I kind of skipped the slides that summarize. We've done a lot of webinars, a lot of presentations at meetings and workshops and things like that. We have a number of publications out on the science end, but the plan is to synthesize and summarize these findings in various documents that are, for management use and for anyone, through extension to use. So we hope to have a lot of different mediums for communication, both written and through the things like this webinar that will continue. And certainly as we gather more data and we've got complex relations across a lot of disciplines, we'll be doing a lot of synthetic summaries of the information.
That's great to know. This is a really good example of the communication between science and practice. We really very much appreciate it. I don't see any more questions, so I'll accept a couple of thank yous to both of you, and I'll just remind folks that this is being recorded and it will be posted on the Network of Oregon Watershed Council's website. Feel free to share the link with anybody that couldn't make it today that you want to make sure gets this good information. So it would be nice to have it archived and in a library form. So it makes it handy. So I'll just end by thanking Brian and Mike for taking the time to do this today, and for everybody for attending. Obviously, there's a lot of interest in this. I know your last webinar had over 100 people. And then today we had 70 or more folks. So obviously a really important topic. So I'll end the webinar here and thank everybody again, and we'll see you in May.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Yes, thank you very much.